Iraq is about to mark 10 years since the US-led invasion, with 30 deaths from bomb attacks last week in Baghdad and 10 more on Sunday in the south. In 2003, Washington unleashed its shock and awe airstrikes, aiming to rid the country of suspected weapons of mass destruction and topple Saddam Hussein. A decade later, arguments persist over whether anything was achieved. RT's Guy Chichikan investigates.
There's no greater cost to war than shattered human lives. The U.S. invasion into Iraq resulted in the deaths of almost 200,000 Iraqis, according to various estimates. The deadly metals released by bombs and bullets continue to kill. In Fallujah, more than half of all babies who were conceived after the start of the war were born with birth defects. The infant mortality rate there is disturbing. On the U.S. side, the war took the lives of 4,486 soldiers.
When you talk a country the size of Iraq, everyone knows someone that was killed. And in the States, when you're here, less than 1% of people participated in the war. So at this point, most Americans have turned that off. It's as though it didn't happen. 10 years of death and destruction, and it's as though in this country, well, we're done with that, we've moved on. And it's difficult, if not impossible, for any veterans and Iraqis to move on from 10 years of death and destruction.
The most recent study puts the total cost of the war at $2 trillion for the U.S. The authors of the report say the country will continue to pay, and over the next 4 decades, that cost could reach $6 trillion. But on top of the human loss and dollars spent, there's also been a political price to pay.
American credibility and influence went down while Iran's went up, and we're still living with the consequences of this 10 years later. So the law of unintended consequences. Our unipolar moment ended when we went into Baghdad, but we didn't know it. From the Berlin Wall to that time, we bestrode the earth like a grand colossus, and after that, it's all been very different.
Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson, who served as Chief of Staff to Secretary of State Colin Powell at the time of the invasion, says Iraq has changed the way the world sees the U.S.
People look at what we do. They do not judge us by our rhetoric. Our rhetoric is high and lofty, and we talk about human rights and human dignity and freedom and democracy, and then what do? We mount a war of aggression in Iraq, kill a couple 100,000 people, and mess it up majorly, including the region. Much of what is happening now is a result of what we did in Iraq. The world looks at that and they say, this is not something we need in the world, this kind of absolutely inept leadership. And when this happens in the world of international relations, the world stands up and begins to balance the hegemon.
Today, many of those who cheered for the Iraq War on TV shows and in their memoirs struggle to justify the decisions they made and the actions they took.
Yes, history will hold them responsible and render some sort of indictment, but there's no accountability for people who make grievous errors in high office in the United States. We're the United States of amnesia, as Gore Vidal so aptly said.
The tendency to forget and to move on could prove dangerous with new war talk brewing in Washington, with many of the same people who pushed for the Iraq War now pushing to drag America into another conflict in the Middle East.
A number of insiders from the Bush administration have come out and said the desire to topple the Iraqi government trumped all other considerations at the time of the invasion. There was no credible intelligence that Saddam had weapons of mass destruction or ties with al-Qaeda, and yet the administration wanted to invade at all costs. What we see from these policymakers today are just different shades of denial. In Washington, I'm Guy Chichikan.